So the first thing that I have to say is felicidades for the appointment of Cochrane Mexico. I'm very pleased to hear about this development, and I wish you and all of your colleagues the best of success, but also enjoyment in working together for the benefit of patients and the relatives of patients. Giordano asked me to say something useful during this brief interview, and we've been talking about some possibilities, and one that came up relates to a systematic review, a Cochrane systematic review, which actually is featured in the current issue of the Cochrane Library, and it concerns whether one should use colloid albumin and other starch and other sorts of colloid resuscitation fluids rather than crystalloids, Ringer's lactate, for example, for resuscitation. The history of the introduction of albumin in particular is quite interesting. Albumin was given to 6 American sailors who were burned during the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And those 6 sailors survived. And it gave rise to the idea that giving albumin to someone who's shocked and needing fluid resuscitation was useful on the basis of 6 cases having survived. Well, I imagine that all of you know that that's an unsatisfactory basis for recommending a particular treatment, whatever the treatment. So gradually, 1 or 2 people started to do controlled trials comparing colloids with crystalloids. And frankly, they weren't able to find any advantages. And very early on in the Cochrane collaboration, in the 90s, the first version of the review, which is the most up-to-date version of which is actually featured on the Cochrane Library at the moment, the first version was published. And if anything, it suggested that people given albumin were more likely to die than those that had been treated with crystalloids, normal saline or Ringer's lactate. And what was interesting was the outrage that this caused. It obviously was caused a great deal of distress amongst the people who were selling albumin and colloids of other sorts, because it's a big market and it cost much more than salt water, which was the alternative treatment. So there was a great deal of anger shown at the Cochrane Review at that time. One person said, look, instead of actually getting angry, why don't we actually do further research to find out where the truth may lie? And it was in fact the Australian-New Zealand intensivists who did a very good study, big randomized trial with the acronym SAFE, which wasn't able to detect any advantage of the colloids. And so the argument went on, and now we have I don't know whether it's the 5th version of this review or the 10th version, but basically the most up-to-date one shows that there's really nothing to show that it's worthwhile giving colloids, particularly because they cost a lot of money by comparison with crystalloids. So there we have an example of a treatment which had been used over decades, which hadn't been properly evaluated, and which almost certainly was wasting money, which no health service can afford to do, given the costs of some of the treatments that they have. And it's one example to illustrate how wrong it is to acquiesce, to basically live with uncertainty about widely given treatments. Now, another example concerns whether or not to give steroids, systemic steroids, to people who have sustained traumatic brain injury. There was a difference of opinion about this. Some doctors and neurologists and neurosurgeons, some of them gave steroids, others of them didn't give steroids. Those that gave it presumably thought that they were actually perhaps reducing the amount of swelling around the trauma and that would be protective of the brain. Others weren't convinced by that. Now, there again, this disagreement had existed for at least 30 years. And you could see that why there was the disagreement, because when a systematic review was done, it showed that there was genuine reason to be uncertain. It didn't either suggest that the treatment was useful or that it was harmful. And I'm very glad to say that a very big controlled trial was done called CRASH. And what it showed was that this treatment was actually had been killing people. So it took 30 or more years to find out that a widely used treatment was actually harming patients and killing some of them. Now, what are the lessons from this that I would like to propose to you for your consideration? It's first of all that there are important treatments in widespread use about which there's uncertainty about their value, their effectiveness and their cost effectiveness. The example of colloids, it's not so much on their effectiveness, they're as effective as crystalloids are, but they cost much more. And it's a waste of money to spend money on them. What about the other one, the steroids? There again, that's even worse situation. It's not because steroids are expensive to give to people with brain injury. It's because in the light of the best evidence, the systematic review, they do harm, they kill people. So my final message is, in the kind opportunity which Giordano has given me to have a word or two with you, is that clinicians ought to demand that research funders address questions which we know from systematic reviews to have been inadequately answered, and which must be answered if patients and their interests and their relatives' interests can be expected to trust the medical profession. Research must become embedded in the expectation of normal, everyday clinical practice. And the research world must support those clinicians who believe that that is important. We could say, for example, in summary, patients come before patents. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. Muchas gracias.
Excellent, Iain. So what you're saying is that pacientes antes que las patentes.
Exactly.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.